2022. So on a debate, I'm now joined by CP committee member, Dr. Alex Mashilo. They, of course, responded to Thursday's SONA by saying the president should re-examine his views on government's role in job creation, saying that view is vitally flawed. That's the view of the SACP. Good evening, Dr. Alex Mashilo, and thank you very much for your time. Do you think the president took heed of your very strongly worded letter that you wrote to him on Friday?
Yes, his message was a bit different today. Remember that on Friday he asserted that the government does not create jobs. And many people in South Africa understand by the government that you are referring to the state, and by jobs you are referring to employment. And he said that he implied that the private sector or private enterprise or private businesses were the only job creators in the economy. That view, we said, was fatally flawed. For a number of reasons. It was inconsistent with the economy of South Africa. And in fact, the president has the opportunity in leading the cabinet and the country just to look back at the history of South Africa, compare what happened before and after 1994. When we take international trips to countries like Cuba, you hear even children said, this happened before the revolution. This happened after the revolution. So in South Africa, during the colonial and apartheid era, the state built its participation in the economy. Major state-owned enterprises, some of which were the leading manufacturers in this country, were established. It was in that process that ISCO was established. It would later be privatized. It is currently owned by ArcelorMittal. But it was in that process that Eskom was established, Telkom was established, Transnet, and you see Transnet has many divisions, Transnet Rail, Transnet Rail, and so others. Metro Rail, Telkom was established there. The Post Bank and the Post Office were established there.
Yeah.
The list goes on. But you see what happened. The successive colonial and apartheid regime made use of state participation in the economy to take care of the plight of their constituencies and to support the growth of the white capitalist class, both British and Afrikaner. The British state participated in that bank through colonial processes. It was as a result of that British state participation that British capital occupied key positions in the economy of South Africa. If you looked at how this economy was organized, British capital almost controlled the mines and the banks. And Afrikaner capital controlled agriculture. And of course, there were other sectors in the economy that were shared in that particular way. What the president has to do is just to sit back a little bit. What state-owned enterprises did the democratic government post-1994 create to participate in the economy of South Africa, to take care of the needs of the constituencies of this democracy? I can tell you that the reason why there are still racial differences articulated in inequality is because the constituencies that benefited from the colonial and apartheid oppression of the black majority are still enjoying the fruits of the benefits acquired from that process. This is the inheritance.
Yeah.
When you compare the lives of black people to the lives of white people to the lives of white people in South Africa, and you are honest with yourself, you will notice the difference.
Yeah.
That difference was driven by the state. So the democratic state in terms of our constitution, right in the preamble, has to drive a process of redress.
Yeah.
It can't be that the apartheid state was better. The ESCOM that we complain about today was built by the apartheid state. Yeah. What did the democratic state build?
So it's
all major state-owned enterprises that we have in our economy are those that we inherited from the colonial and apartheid regime. Yeah. So in this in this situation, it is so painful to listen to a leader of a democratic state tell the constituencies of this democracy, those who suffered, that in fact they must go to the private sector because that's what creates employment and not the state. That is the context in which we found ourselves left with no other option but to distance ourselves from that argument. And that, by the way, is not the president's argument. Yeah. It is a neoliberal argument which was intensified in the 1970s when the ideology of neoliberalism packaged measures such as privatization, outsourcing, delimiting the role of the state in the economy, converting the state into a field of capital accumulation or private wealth accumulation by the private sector. Yeah. That transformation of the state, the president has to think about it very carefully, looking at the constituency, because if that does not happen, there is this gulf that is emerging between the constituencies that historically supported the ANC and the ANC. And if you want to study that gulf, you must look at the electoral outcome patterns. The ANC is declining, and the majority of the unemployed, the president today in parliament talked about just the over 11 million. It's not just the over 11 million. We have approximately 12.5 million unemployed South Africans. And I can tell you, the majority of them is black, women, and the youth. And Africans are the worst affected. No one will save them if it is not the democratic state.
Let's continue in a moment with SACP committee member Dr. Alex Mashilo on that conversation here on In Focus. Stay with us. Welcome back. Live tonight, the conversation continues. SACP committee member Dr. Alex Mashilo with us, pointing out very strongly that it is a painful thing to hear Democratic President distancing the state from creating work for 12.5 million South Africans who are out of employment currently, and putting that responsibility in the hands of the private sector. Is it an anti-revolutionary thing and really complete cop-out to recognize these facts, Dr. Alex, that the public sector in 2002 only employed 1.9 million people, and in 2017 it employed 2.8 million people. Over the same period, the private sector employed 8.2 million people to 13.5 million people. To say, indeed, those 12.5 million people, a majority of them, if they are going to be employed very quickly and sooner, it would have to be in the private sector.
Yeah, I'm struggling to hear you. I'm asking that the producers do something in terms of sound engineering.
Did you get my question? Okay.
Yes. You see, Thabo, even those figures are not disaggregated. I will give you an example. The president in his State of the Nation address mentioned a very important success in the Limpopo province, where under the road agency Limpopo, a road of about 40 kilometers was constructed in a labor-intensive process. Hang on a little bit. He went on to say there are small enterprises that benefited from the construction of that road. And here now I come to demonstrate that these figures that are attributed to private sector employment are not disaggregated and in fact include the public sector extended. If in this country you count everybody who is employed by state organizations and who is employed in a state tender or a state contract or license, that person is working in a state-created employment. It does not matter whether the state gave a private company a tender to build the road. The employment in constructing that road is state-created employment. So there is something wrong statistically. If you look at the statistics that were mentioned and apply a value chain analysis to those statistics, you remember around 2008, 2009, we adopted something called the New Growth Path. And when you looked at the New Growth Path, it spoke about jobs drivers. And in articulating its jobs drivers, it used the language, the agricultural value chain, the mining value chain, the social value chain, sector by sector. I can tell you, if you can take everybody employed in a tender in this country, employed in a state-contracted work, those people are in state-created employment, and they are included in the statistics that the president mentioned today of people who are said to be employed by private sector firms. So it is important to recognize the contribution of the state in its totality insofar as employment creation is concerned. And the Statistics South Africa can play a great role in disaggregating the statistics, making use of a value chain analysis, so that pure private sector employment becomes pure private sector employment and state-created employment becomes state-created employment. Then we will have the correct statistics to refer to. However, elevating this point does not mean that the private sector does not create employment. But in the same way, it does not mean that because the private sector creates employment, the state does not create employment.
Yeah. In unleashing then our productive capacity, where should we be focusing our energy? Where is the potential for most jobs going to be created?
From 1996, a more comprehensive economic policy was adopted. That economic policy introduced changes. There was a liberalization of international trade tariffs. So many changes were introduced, I can tell you. And in fact, in certain industries, the removal or liberalization or cut in trade tariffs went at a more rapid pace and deeper than we could have done under the World Trade Organization bound tariff rules. As a result, South Africa has not industrialized post-1994. If there is something we experienced, which is consistent with the high rate of unemployment that we have seen, is that we have deindustrialized. So you cannot turn around the South African economy if you shield certain policy instruments from scrutiny. South Africa, to turn around its economic situation, there should be no single policy left without examination. If the macroeconomic framework continues to be left without examination, if it continues to be praised, while we have such a big unemployment crisis, I can tell you, in 2026, our unemployment will be close to 40%. We will not overcome this unemployment situation. So the so-called structural reforms, by the way, they don't come from South Africa, and the president might be aware about this because he studies international institutions and the South African economy. The so-called structural reforms, which were introduced in August 2019 by the National Treasury through a discussion document, were recommended year in, year out by the OECD. If you look at the OECD publication called Going for Growth, Structural Reforms, you will see all these things that are referred to as reforms. We expressed our views about this within the alliances, the SACP. Look at those reforms. They are not industrializing the economy, all right? They are reforms to unbundle spaces occupied by state-owned enterprises and bring in private profit competition in those spaces. So, unlike the apartheid regime that built productive capacity in the state to take care of the needs of its constituencies, our democratic state today was referring its constituencies to the private sector. And by the way, the private sector in South Africa is not transformed. You must ask the workers who wake up every morning, run to work. They face racism in industry. They face sexism. In the private sector, ownership patterns are largely untransformed. When you talk about the private sector, please bear in mind that you are not talking about all South Africans. You are talking about a certain section of South Africans who are in charge.
Let's talk about state-owned enterprises themselves. I mean, they are not being used effectively or even managed effectively at this particular point for a variety of reasons. Amongst them is what you have, of course, as the SACP, have raised alarms on: state capture, maladministration, and so on and so forth. So therefore, they are also not strong instruments that are currently, that can be relied on currently to employ more people.
You are right. They are not strong instruments. It is the task of the government, led by the president, to turn state-owned enterprises around, to make them strong instruments, and over and above the existing state-owned enterprises, to create new state-owned enterprises. That is the role of the state. And this democratic state has just to look back a little bit on how those who oppressed us created these sectors to take care of the plight of the needs of their constituencies. This democratic state has the duty to also take care of the democratic constituencies of this state. When these constituencies are unhappy, like the approximately 12.5 million who are unemployed, I can tell you, more and more ANC's electoral support as the governing party will decline until it does away with itself from power. It is important to appreciate that we must respond to the needs of the people. And by the way, I was following your earlier conversation on one of the, China featured quite a lot. Let me just give the following example. In China, in the financial sector, you have the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. That Industrial and Commercial Bank of China owns 20% of Standard Bank of South Africa. Hang on a little bit. What does the South African state own in the banking sector in this country?
Let's leave it there.
We have been having so many years, and we had so many years saying the state, please establish your presence in the financial sector, because the growth you see, for example, in China, is driven by the state's own financial sector participation in that economy.
Dr.
There
Alex,
are others like the Construction Bank of China, the Bank of China, the Bank of Communications of China, the Agricultural Bank of China, the Agricultural Development of China, the China Development Bank, and the Import-Export Bank of China. All these are state-owned.
I'll have to bring you back in. I'll have to bring you back in, Dr. Alex, so that we can have that conversation in broader terms. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this evening. But thank you very much for coming through. Dr. Alex Mashilo there for the SACP.